With British sponsorship and new sources of funding from the United States, the Zionist project gained momentum after World War I. Jewish settlements and land acquisition in Palestine rapidly grew. Though Palestine was now a British colony, the Jewish Agency was set up as a de facto government in the Zionist-controlled areas. The agency began building its own military and later on a proper army. While there were inevitable and sometimes serious clashes between the British sponsors and the Zionist leadership, the nature of the relationship was unlike any other in the far-flung British Empire. The nature of the relationship can be highlighted by a meeting that took place on July 22, 1921, at the home of British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to discuss the situation in Palestine. Others who attended the meeting were Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and Colonial Secretary and future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It is unimaginable for any leader of any national liberation movement to be treated with such respect by the top officials of the British Empire. Certainly, no Palestinian Arab leaders would be invited to London to meet with the Prime Minister at the Foreign Secretary's home. The British government was at the time the chief organizer of the international imperialist campaign to overthrow the Russian Revolution. The Zionist leaders made their aims crystal clear. When the Zionists acquired an area, their goal was to make it exclusively Jewish. They wanted to get rid of the land of any indigenous population altogether. Zionist settlement and businesses were urged to hire only Jewish labor. Jewish-owned businesses that disobeyed, often in the interest of garnering greater profits by hiring Palestinians at lower wages, were subjected to boycott or violence by other Zionists. As the settler population increased from about 10% in the early 1920s to 30% by the end of 1930s, the discussion about transfer intensified amongst the Zionist politicians. Transfer in the Zionist discourse meant expelling the indigenous Arab population from Palestine to make way for their envisioned state. In 1919, the US-based King Crane Commission traveled to Syria and Palestine to investigate the situation. Their report stated that the initial claim often submitted by the Zionist representatives that they have a right to Palestine based on occupation of 2000 years ago can barely be considered serious. It became clear to the Zionist leaders that the only way to achieve their objective was through military superiority, as they were well aware the Palestinians were not going to give up their land voluntarily. The building up of Zionist armed forces was not a problem, but how to talk about it publicly was an issue. This led to the split in the Zionist movement. In the early 1920s, David Ben-Gurion, who had emigrated from Poland in 1906, emerged as the central Zionist leader inside Palestine. Another key leader was Vladimir Jabotinsky, who wrote two articles titled The Iron Wall, published in 1923. Jabotinsky argued that the Zionists should be honest with themselves and the world by saying outright that it was a settler project that could only be achieved by overwhelming force, what he called the Iron Wall. Ben-Gurion and the mainstream leaders such as Weizmann, Golda Meir, and other labor Zionists wanted to pursue a more diplomatic course. They publicly rejected Jabotinsky's open advocacy of racism and terrorism. This led to a major split in the Zionist movement at the time. Ben-Gurion and his labor and other socialist Zionists would go on to form the pseudo-left Labour Party that dominated the Israeli government for the first 3 decades of its existence. While Ben-Gurion and many of the founders of Israel spoke in the name of socialism, this had more to do with the popularity of socialism among the working class of that time. They never really believed in socialism. The Jews of the Russian, German and Austro-Hungarian empires and other European countries were a persecuted and subjugated people. Although European Jews shared a common religion and in some areas a common language and culture, they lacked a contiguous territory and did not have a unified single state. The Zionists, while aiming to create a Jewish national state, did not seek to acquire territory in Eastern Europe, where most of the European Jewish population was concentrated as well as most violently oppressed. Instead, the Zionists offered to make themselves available to be transported as settlers to any number of places in the colonized continents of Asia, Africa and Latin America before settling on Palestine. Political Zionism was thus a unique form of narrow nationalism. Lacking its own indigenous land base, it could only hope to succeed as an extension of European colonialism. Unlike any genuine national liberation movement, Zionism was always completely dependent on imperialist sponsorship. This reality shaped the Zionist movement and its political alliances. The priority of the Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionist was never really socialism, nor the well-being of the workers. In his 1954 book, Rebirth and Destiny of Israel, Ben-Gurion looks back on the earlier days of settlement and comments about it. Their modus operandi was clear. Ben-Gurion and the Labour Party were simply reactionary bourgeoisie nationalists posing as socialists. Their support for trade unionism both before and after the founding of Israel was aimed at only winning the support of the Jewish workers. Zionism gained strength in the aftermath of World War I, a period that was fertile ground for the growth of reactionary nationalist and fascist movements in Europe, such as those in Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland, and a number of other countries. Though it had its own distinct roots, Zionism shared some of the characteristics of the reactionary European movements. It fiercely opposed the anti-colonial and genuine national liberation movements. Zionism's opposition to true liberation movements is well documented in Israel, base of Western imperialism. This is inevitable due to Zionist dependence on Britain and its character as a European colonial phenomenon. Vladimir Jabotinsky did not conceal his connection to the most reactionary nationalism of his time. His political faction was known as the Revisionists because they wanted to revise the Balfour Declaration to include both the banks of the Jordan River in their projected state. So basically they wanted at least part of present-day Palestine and Jordan. The Revisionists formed the Baath Party, which included supporters of Italian fascist dictator Mussolini. Baath gave birth to the self-identified terrorist paramilitary organization Irgun and Lehi in the 1930s and 1940s. Amongst their leaders were the two future Israeli prime ministers Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. After 1948, Baath became the Herut Party, and 2 decades later, Herut became the dominant force in Israeli politics in the late 1970s. When Menachem Begin visited America soon after the creation of Israeli state in 1948, a letter to the New York Times signed by 28 Jewish liberals and progressives, including Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt, denounced him as a terrorist right-wing chauvinist. His movement was closely similar in its origin, method, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and the fascist parties. Within the Jewish community, they have preached a mix of ultra-nationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority. Because the Israeli was a colonial implantation that could only succeed by crushing the indigenous population, the Iron Wall doctrine eventually triumphed, and along with it, the politics of revisionist Zionism. It is today an integral part of Israeli state ideology and strategy. Overwhelming military force has long been accepted as an essential across the entire Zionist political spectrum. The dispossession of an entire people have never been possible anywhere except by extreme, often genocidal violence. Palestine is no exception. While Jabotinsky is less well known in the United States, and although his followers were treated as marginal figures in the early decades of Israel's existence, his brutal doctrine has dominated Israeli politics ever since the state was formed.